Good afternoon, everybody. This is David Anderson, EVP of WISE, and I'm joined by Kyla Duarte from our office, the Euro Challenge Program Manager. And welcome to the second in our webinar series this year relating to the 2020 Euro Challenge. As you know, we try to host 4 or 5 webinars throughout the year to help students, teachers, and so on learn about different aspects of the program, the competition, to help them prepare for the preliminary round that will come very fast in March of next year. Today's webinar is really quite special because it's called From Europe to the Euro, and it really is a fascinating historical journey through the beginnings of the European Union until today. And we have a great presenter of this historical perspective, Ben Carliner from the EU Delegation Office in Washington, D.C. Ben is a senior economist there. He's been at the Delegation Office for 6 years and really has a wonderful historical perspective about this European project that began shortly after World War II. And so with that, I will say thanks to Ben. Before Ben starts, I will turn it to Kyla, who will give you a couple of housekeeping items relating to whether you want to submit questions that may arise during the presentation. So, Kyla.
Hi, everyone. So if you'd like to submit questions during the presentation, you can submit them using the panel on the right side of your computer. It is under the Questions tab. We will be answering all of the questions at the end of the webinar.
And with that, Ben, thanks again, and we will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, guys. I'm very much looking forward to doing the presentation today. Welcome to you all, and good luck with the presentations that you are about to start creating for this year's challenge. I want to just say that so what we're going to do here, you know, even for people who follow Europe pretty closely, the European institutions can be a little bit confusing. It's a setup sort of unlike any other in the world, how the EU's institutions work and what it really is. And so what we're just going to go over today are just the basics of where this came from, why the EU was created, how the institutions developed, and how they work in their current form today, because it's really developed a lot since World War II. So let's just get started. And let me see here yeah, here we go. So what we're going to do is do the history, and then we're going to do talk about functionally how the institutions work. Then we're going to take a deeper dive into the monetary union, and then we're going to finish up by just talking a little bit about why the transatlantic alliance is so important and how the EU and the US work together. So what is the European Union? Well, it's not a country, and it's also not just some multilateral institution like the UN that is sort of, well, I don't want to denigrate the UN, but it's more than just a talking shop. It's really unique in the world, where the member states of the European Union, in certain areas, but not all areas, have decided to pool their sovereignty, to give some of the sovereignty that other countries keep, and hand it over to the European Union. And they do that for a variety of reasons, but basically it's in order to, you know, promote their values of liberty and democracy and human rights, and also to improve their economic standing and influence in the world, and also to, perhaps most importantly, to preserve peace and prosperity on the European continent. And to understand how we got there, it helps to start at the beginning and look back into history. Actually, before we do that, let's just give you a couple brief comparisons. So the EU actually is bigger than the United States. It's got 512 million people as of last count, which is a bit bigger than the US. It is The economy is about the same size. That headline GDP figure that you see, 18.8 trillion, that fluctuates depending on the exchange rate of the euro versus the dollar. But the point to remember is that on a per capita basis, Europe is not quite as rich as the United States. So while some places in Europe are just as rich, you think of the major cities like London and Paris, and Munich and Amsterdam, these places are comparable to wealthy American cities, but other parts of the EU are poorer, and so on a per capita basis, it's not quite as rich. However, it's much more densely settled. The EU is not as big in physical size as the United States, and hence there's way more people per density. It's way more urbanized. The other thing is that there's a lot more official languages than the United States, although the lingua franca for the institutions is increasingly English. And even if the UK eventually figures out how to leave, English will probably remain the most important language because it's neutral, and because the Germans can speak to the Italians, can speak to the Portuguese in English, and everybody feels like they're on the same level. So to start at 1945, the end of World War II. Now, for those of you listening today, I suppose that seems like a very long time ago. But my grandparents were still alive in World War II, and so we're more connected to this time than it may seem to you. But anyway, after World War II, Europe was just devastated. Apart from the tens of millions of people that had lost their lives in the war, um, almost everything had been destroyed. The industrial capacity, the factories, the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the power and water systems, everything was just a wreck. There was large movements of refugees as borders changed after the war. There was food shortages, and not only that, but very quickly after the surrender of the Germans, you had the emergence of the beginnings of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union, because Soviet armies were in control of Eastern Germany and much of Eastern Europe. And very quickly it became apparent that there was going to be the Cold War, that there was going to be this geopolitical power struggle between liberal democracy and capitalism in the West and communism in the East. And so right after the war, you can see here that the continent was split. The green is the parts that were liberated by the Americans and the Brits, and the orange is where the Soviets were in control and where they were quickly moving to set up their own communist regimes. And so what happened was, because the economy there was still devastated, and you had people who were hungry, and you had this emerging geopolitical conflict, the United States decided that it needed to help. And so they set up the Marshall Plan, and under the context of what was called the European Organization for Economic Cooperation, where the aim was to kickstart the economies of Western Europe, to make sure that people had enough food to eat, and that you started to rebuild housing, because lots of people were homeless and did not have proper shelter. And so they needed to get things started in order to compete with the Soviets and to prevent any kind of reemergence of conflict in Europe, and to prevent communism from spreading any further westwards. Now, the Soviets quickly responded with their own organization called Comecon, and pretty soon after that, you had the building of, the raising of the Iron Curtain over Eastern Europe, as Winston Churchill called it, and the building of the Berlin Wall and things like that. But the thing to recognize is that for Western Europe, the Marshall Plan was very successful in getting growth going again, and getting industry restarted, construction restarted. And because of the success of this, and because of the global political environment, 6 European countries decided to create, with the Schuman Declaration, the European Coal and Steel Community. Now, technically what this was that they opened up their coal and steel industries to competition in these 6 countries. So it was France, Italy, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And it wasn't just about economics at this point, because part of the idea was that if you don't have a national domestic coal and steel sector that you control, that's sort of the basis of any military industrial complex of your armaments industry. If you need to build tanks and cannons and warships and fighter planes and things like that, you need to have these domestic coal and steel industries. And so by opening them up and allowing companies to merge and compete with one another across borders, it was a way to prevent the reemergence of conflict between these countries by pooling these things together. So it was partly about getting the economy going, but also partly about ensuring peace by making the economic interests between these countries so intertwined that it wouldn't be worth it for them to go into conflict again. And in 1951, just a few years after the war, this was still a real concern. So they did this. They started with the Schuman Declaration in 1951. This also was relatively successful. And so by 1957, people agreed that this kind of economic integration was good for the economy, good politically in terms of competing with the Soviet Union, and good for ensuring peace and cooperation in Western Europe. And so they expanded this cooperation and created the European Economic Community. The idea behind this was to create one single market. Just like in the United States, where you don't have Texas and New York and Massachusetts and Colorado individually controlling markets and setting tariffs or regulations that prevent goods from other states being traded there. The federal government regulates and controls interstate trade. The idea was similar, that let's create a single market in Europe where companies from France can do business in Belgium and Germany and vice versa. And so this single market was based on 4 freedoms: the freedom of people, goods, services, and capital. And so that means that people can move back and forth if they get a job in another country, that goods can be traded freely back and forth. Ideally, services would also be freely traded back and forth. This is something that, in fact, is more complicated than it sounds and that they're still working on. But in any event, they started it with this, and then free movement of capital, of finance across borders too. At the same time, this created an external customs border. So there was no more tariffs in between the 6 founding countries of the European Economic Community. Everything could be traded freely across borders without tariffs. But there was a tariff at the edge. So, you know, if the US was exporting goods into the European Economic Community, that all those 6 countries would have a common tariff for all imports from the rest of the world. So over time, this too was very successful. And in fact, in the original preamble of the Rome Treaty that created the economic community, they foresaw that they would continue closer cooperation, closer integration, so that they could eliminate the barriers that divide Europe. And indeed, that is what kept on happening. And not only did you have a deepening of this cooperation and integration, but you also had a slow process, but you also had a process of expanding, because other European countries looked at what the original 6 were doing, and they said, oh, that's actually a pretty good idea. It's been pretty successful. Their businesses have big advantages by being able to sell into a bigger market and gain economies of scale. And so in 1961, they launched the European Free Trade Area with the Scandinavian countries, the UK, Portugal, Switzerland, and Austria. And and this was, and so they basically signed. They didn't have, they weren't members of the European Economic Community yet, but they signed a free trade agreement with them, and um, this sort of set the stage for further expansion. And so the first thing that happened is that other countries like Finland and Iceland joined the free trade area. But then here you can see how the European Economic Community continues to grow. So that's what it looked like in '57. It was still the original 6 countries. And then in 1973, some of the members of the European Free Trade Association joined, and also Ireland joined. So Denmark, Ireland, and the UK joined the European Economic Community. Then in '81, Greece joined, and then Portugal and Spain followed in '86. And in 1990, a pretty big thing happened, which was that the Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, Germany was reunified, and Eastern Europe was freed. So right away in 1990, as soon as German reunification happened, the former East Germany became a part of Germany and immediately enjoined membership of the European Economic Community. Now, it took a little bit longer for the rest of Eastern Europe to join, but I think that one of the things that is one of the great historical successes of the EU, and at this stage it was still the EEC, was that it provided this sort of roadmap for these countries that had been, essentially sort of colonized or occupied by Soviet troops, and where they'd had this communist system imposed on them. And then suddenly the Soviet Union collapses, the Soviet troops go home, and then the countries, they have these sort of revolutions, these peaceful revolutions for the most part. They create these new democracies, but how do you do it? What do you do? How do you suddenly create a capitalist economy and democratic institutions from scratch? And in this regard, the EU sort of provided a roadmap. They said, here is how we do it in the West, and if you sort of work hard in terms of creating some of the institutions, and there's a lot of stuff you need to do. You need to collect tax collection, you need to build roads and infrastructure, you need to provide social services, you need to have rules and regulations for how markets are going to work, how banks are going to work, and a lot of the stuff could be copied from what they were already doing in Western Europe. So I guess before we get there, in 1992, there was a further deepening of the EEC, where the European Union was formally created with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and this expanded cooperation from simply trade to include a bit more economic deepening, but also some foreign policy and some security policy cooperation, and also some cooperation in terms of the justice system. So this happened in '92, and then in '95, you saw 3 more countries join: Austria, Finland, and Sweden. And then finally in 2004, all these Eastern European countries who had been, working to build market economies, to establish liberal democratic governments and institutions and judicial systems, they finally had been deemed that they had done enough that they qualified for membership, and they were allowed to join. And this ushered in a big economic boom in many of these countries, where the standard of living and the size of the GDP and job creation and all that stuff really increased a lot, and people's standard of living went up a lot in the next few years in these countries. And it already had been, since the decline since the fall of the Soviets, standard of living had increased a lot. So then Bulgaria and Romania joined in 2007, and Croatia is the most recent one. So, and just to let you know, it's not necessarily over. Europe could continue expanding. The countries of the former Yugoslavia and Albania are in talks to join. Turkey also has been talking about joining. That's looking not particularly likely right now, but you never know. They haven't ruled it out, and Europe, it could continue expanding as time goes on. So just a quick word about Brexit. The United Kingdom had this referendum in June 2016. The people voted, a narrow majority, 52% of the population voted to leave the European Union. This might happen. They're currently trying to negotiate the withdrawal agreement and the framework. They're going to go to elections in the UK. We will see what happens. They're going to have to do it before January 31st, 2020. And then there's still the long-term relationship to be formalized in a longer-term negotiation. So we can talk about that maybe a little bit at the end, but that is a big deal for Europe, but it's going to be manageable. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about how the European institutions function. So I think it's going to be helpful to compare things to how the United States works for Europe, just in thinking about it. So on the one hand, you've got, in the United States, we have the Constitution, which is the sort of legal basis of our government, and then we have an executive branch in the presidency, and the legislative branch in Congress, and the judicial branch. And you also have these same four things in Europe, but they function a little bit differently. So in Europe, it's based a little, they don't have a European constitution, but they do have treaties. And the thing to remember, the biggest difference, there's two really big differences. One is that the member states in Europe are much more powerful than US states are. They are much more in control of things, and that's a big difference. And then the second big difference is that it's a parliamentary system as opposed to congressional, and that is also a difference in how the government works, because when you have a parliamentary majority, then you can control the executive branch by virtue of controlling the legislature. So they don't have all of the checks and balances that we do in the United States. So let's get into this a little bit more. There's actually two executive branches in Europe. One is the European Council, and some people like to compare this to the US Senate, because this is where the heads of state of all the member states meet and make important decisions and discuss things. But in truth, the European Council is more powerful than the Senate. And a lot of the most significant decisions take place at the Council by the heads of state. And remember that these are all democratically elected heads of state who are responsible to their electorates back home in their specific countries. And then there's another executive branch called the European Commission. And the European Commission is sort of the administrative arm of the executive branch. It has a full-time bureaucracy of people who work for different ministries of the European Commission. Probably, or certainly, the two most important things that the Commission is responsible for is maintaining the integrity of the single market and doing all the rules and regulations that keep the single market functioning. And then the other big thing is that it negotiates trade agreements with other countries on behalf of the European Union. But it does lots of other things too. And because it's a parliamentary system, the European Commission has the ability to propose legislation that's then going to be considered by the European Parliament. And it runs all the day-to-day business, not just about the single market and trade, but all of the areas where member states have given up sovereignty to the European Union. They run that, and they spend the money, and they enforce the rules. And the Commission, there's 28 commissioners, and I think it's useful to think of them as rough equivalents to cabinet level in the United States. So they have the equivalent of Treasury secretaries and Commerce secretaries and secretaries of the State Department. And each of these 28 commissioners is appointed by the member state. So there's one representing each member state, and they are not the heads of state of these countries. They are different people who are appointed by the member states, and then they sit there in their cabinet level positions in charge of various ministries doing the day-to-day work of the commission. Then legislatively, you've got the European Parliament. They are elected to 5-year terms. They have to pass all the EU laws and adopt the EU budgets. They also have to approve the EU commissioners. You might have heard that there was just an election in Europe, and a new commission is set to take place. There's some holdups. It might take place, they might take office on December 1st or January 1st, but for the most part, we know who most of the commissioners are going to be. One reason that things are a little bit delayed is because Parliament did not approve 3 of the commissioners who were nominated by the member states. They said, no, we think these people are not qualified. Again, this is similar to how Congress has to approve cabinet secretaries in the United States. And so they sent them back and asked countries to send new nominees. And as soon as this is completed, the new commission will take office. There's also this thing called the Council of Europe, which is composed of the specific ministers from the member states, and they do some they meet and take decisions on certain important matters as well. So then you also have the European Court of Justice, and that is sort of the equivalent to the US Supreme Court. And they have, the final say on EU laws and make sure that what's going on in the member states is in compliance and agreement with how European laws work. So now let's talk a little bit about the single currency and the monetary union, because this is going to be more relevant to your presentations and to the work that you do for the Euro Challenge. We're going to talk a little bit more about the economics and how monetary union works. So let's go. So this can be a little bit confusing because we're talking about free trade areas in the EU and the EMU. So let's make sure we understand what we're talking about. So first, there was this free trade area that we were talking about that was just about reducing tariffs. Then there's the second level where you have a common external customs union that imposes tariffs and on outside goods that are being imported into the EU. So Turkey, for example, is a member of the EU's customs union, even though it isn't a member of the EU formally. When we were talking about the CE before, the common market, not only are there no tariff barriers, but you have these 4 freedoms: the ability of people, goods, services, and capital to move freely across borders. And you also have common regulations and institutions, including enforcement, that happen at the EU level. So individual member states are not allowed to enact, say, health and safety regulations that would prevent goods from another EU country being sold in their markets. Then a deeper level of integration happens on the level of EMU, which is all the countries that have adopted the euro as their currency, and not every member of the EU has done so. And then on another level, on the level of justice and foreign policy, you have countries who have not given up their sovereignty in all of these areas, especially in terms of foreign and security policy, but who are cooperating in those areas and who have agreed that the European Court of Justice is the sort of highest law of the land for certain types of law to do with the single market and things like that. So then there's a couple of so how does this all work? Don't be too intimidated by this. This just goes to show you how flexible European institutions can be. What this basically shows you is that the real core of Europe, the Eurozone countries, the Euro area countries, the ones in the middle that are in the green line and the yellow line. That's the countries that have integrated the most and that have shared the most sovereignty with European institutions. But other countries have decided not to share quite everything. So, for example, a bunch of countries, Cyprus and Ireland and Denmark and Poland, Sweden, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they are not in the Schengen area. That means that when you fly from one country to the other, you still have to go through customs. Some countries are not in the Eurozone. They have decided to maintain their own currencies for now. Some countries are not in the EU at all, but are in the single market. So, they like to be able to trade freely with the other EU member states, but they have not agreed to cooperate on some other areas. These are countries in the EFTA like Norway and Switzerland and Iceland and Liechtenstein. Finally, I have Turkey, I mentioned that was in the customs union, but not anything else. So it can be all very complicated, but the thing to remember is that there's a lot of flexibility built in, and there's a lot of opportunities for countries to cooperate with each other, with other European countries, as they're able to, as they are interested in cooperating in this area. We're going to join this part of it. And if that goes well, then they might integrate further. So let's see, we can move this along. Whoops, skip that one. So in 1986 is when they originally came up with the idea of having the full internal market. And then in Maastricht in 1992, when we created the European Union's institutions, it laid down the convergence criteria, which is what these Eastern European countries, the criteria that they needed to meet in order to be eligible to join. And also you laid out the goal of establishing the single currency then. And in 1999, the euro was officially introduced as a virtual currency. And what happened was all the old currencies, the French franc, the German mark, the Italian lira, they pegged them at a fixed exchange rate to the euro. And they kept it like that for 3 years in order to get people used to it. And so in those days you'd like go to the store and you'd often see like two prices, one in your old currency, the Deutschmark, and one in the euro. And over time, as people got used to seeing the euro, they just finally phased them out. So in 2002, they introduced the physical coins and banknotes, and all the old currencies disappeared. And it wasn't that they took anybody's money or anything like that. If you just had money in your bank account, suddenly you went from having, 1,000 Deutschmarks to whatever the equivalent in euros was. And so they just, made this switch in denominations, and that's how they introduced it. So as I said, the euro area is not the EU. There's currently 19 member states, all those blue countries who are in the Eurozone. That means they all use the euro. They've all gotten rid of their old currencies. But the other countries have kept their old currencies. So all the green ones, Sweden, Poland, the Czech Republic, and so on, they still have their own currencies, but they're supposed to join the euro area eventually once they're ready. And Denmark and the UK, the yellow countries, they've opted out and will never join the euro if they don't want to. And then there's the funny Kosovo and Montenegro have just unilaterally adopted the euro because they're just emerging from this decade of conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and it was just easier for them to unilaterally adopt the euro. So let's move on and talk a little bit about how economic policy making works. In the US, monetary policy is run by Jerome Powell and the rest of the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. They set short-term interest rates in order to ensure that the economy is growing and that inflation is around 2%, and that the economy is also at full employment. In the euro area, monetary policy is set by the ECB, which is the euro area central bank. Christine Lagarde is the new president of the ECB. She just took office on November 1st, replacing Mario Draghi. And unlike the Federal Reserve, the ECB does not have a mandate to ensure that the economy is operating at full employment. They only have an inflation mandate. And in the ECB's rules, they try to keep inflation close to, but just below 2%. Whereas in the United States, the Fed has a symmetric target where they try to keep inflation near 2%, but it could be slightly above or slightly below. So a much bigger difference is in terms of fiscal policy. In the United States, we have a very big federal budget, and the federal budget, even though Congress decides what money is spent where, it's administered by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. Treasury, the IRS is a part of Treasury. They collect taxes. They direct the monies that the various agencies of the government, that the federal government spends. In Europe, there's nothing like that. All of the member states have kept control of their own fiscal policies. The various tax regimes are done on the national level. All the member states collect their own taxes. There is no IRS for the European Union. And even though the EU does have a budget, it's very small in comparison to the federal budget. And all the money that the EU has to spend is transferred to them by the member states. So they don't have any ability to raise revenue through taxes. Having said that, there are rules about how the member states' fiscal policies are supposed to be conducted. This is called the Stability and Growth Pact. You might have heard of this. There are rules saying, for example, that member states are not supposed to run budget deficits greater than 3% of GDP per year, and that the overall debt to GDP ratio is not supposed to be more than 60%. These rules are not always followed strictly, but the EU and the European Commission does enforce them and does work with the member states to make sure that people are running reasonable and responsible fiscal policies. And then there's a third area of economic policy, structural reforms. These are the kind of things that can be anything from health and safety standards to public education to pensions to healthcare, and the licensing of lawyers and people like that. And in the United States, this happens at both the federal and the state level. Some areas are only are almost or exclusively states, and some areas are mostly federal. So Social Security is run on the federal level in the United States, but states are responsible for education, for primary school education for the most part, and stuff like that. But in Europe, there's basically nothing on the structural level that's done on the European institutional level. It's all the member states. Now, the EU sometimes does give policy recommendations to the member states if they're having trouble with their pension schemes or things like that, but it's always up to the member state to do it and change it. Okay, so that's a little bit about the institutions. Let's finish up by looking a little bit about the transatlantic relationship. Just so you have a perspective on things, the US and the EU together are far and away the largest parts of the global economy still. They account for 50% of world GDP, 30% of world trade. You hear a lot in the news about trade with China, and obviously China is in national terms, it's the second largest economy in the world after the US. But if you count Europe as a whole, Europe is still bigger than China. The EU and the United States are each other's primary source of foreign direct investment. the United States has invested something like $2.4 trillion in the EU, and the EU has invested something like $2.6 trillion in the United States. And when we're talking about this, what we mean is American companies building factories and opening offices in Europe and vice versa. So what that investment is companies from Europe and the United States investing in each other, creating jobs, building industrial capacity, office capacity, stuff like that. And this trade's really important. There's 15 million jobs that are supported by this. Lots of back and forth trade. It's very, very important, and it's important to the standard of living on both sides of the Atlantic. There's also a lot of cooperation in foreign policy. There used to be a little bit more than there are these days, but don't take all the political proclamations from political people as just the state of things. The people who work in the militaries and in the security services and in the governments of these countries still continue to cooperate a lot, and they cooperate specifically on fighting terrorism and promoting the rule of law around the world. And together, the EU and the US provide a lot of the development assistance to the developing world and work together to provide humanitarian relief and things like that. So here, Federica Mogherini is the outgoing EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, talking about cooperation. Gordon Sondland is the US Ambassador to the EU. He's been in the news recently, but even he, who has been critical of the EU a bit in recent years, understands how important the EU-US relationship is. And so with that, I think I'll stop. I think we've been very efficient in this. I hope this was useful, but I am very happy to take any questions or comments that you have at this point. I know we've covered a lot, but hopefully this gave you a little bit of a sense of where Europe came from, how it was created in the ashes of World War II, and out of the destruction came this desire to promote peace and prosperity on the European continent, to rebuild people's lives, and to, in the early days, it was also about fighting communism, but now it's been transformed into this thing where it's becoming about not just economics, but also about promoting freedom and democracy around the world. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Wise and see if we have any questions.
Ben, thank you. That was a really great presentation. I have a question. You mentioned the prospect of further integration of policy across the Euro area and the EU. And I've read about the possibility of increasing the EU budget. There's discussion about harmonizing the banking system and so on. What's your sense of the appetite for further integration at this point? Is it discussion only, or there are real steps being taken to implement further deepening policies?
Well, that is a key question for the incoming commission that will take office in the next month or two. And as you were alluding to, after in the wake of the global financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crisis, there's been a lot of talk of moving forward specifically on banking union and capital markets union that would allow much more integration of the European financial sector and break some of the reliance that European banks have on the national government of the country that they are domiciled in. And I think that there is appetite for some movement here. The German finance minister recently floated a proposal saying that the Germans would consider creating a European deposit insurance scheme. And that can be a very technical thing, but it's sort of like in the United States. all regular people's bank accounts, their checking accounts, their savings accounts. You might have heard of the FDIC. That's this Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Everybody's checking accounts are guaranteed by the federal government up to something like $200,000, even if the bank goes bankrupt and goes out of business. So you never have to worry about it. You never have to pull your money out of the bank if you hear that anything bad's happening. They're trying to introduce a similar thing in Europe. They currently have it on the level of the member states, but they don't have a European-wide one, and so that would be a big step forward. In terms of proposals to create a much bigger European budget or to create a true fiscal union, I think that that's much farther off. There's very little political right now that's a very hard sell politically. There's not a lot of support for it in a lot of countries where there would need to be support. And for questions that go that close to questions of the core sovereignty of countries, are you going to give up some of your rights to tax and spend? That's very sensitive, and I think that it's important to remember that the EU will almost certainly never be the United States of Europe. They're not in the process of creating a single European country the way that we have the United States of America, but they are trying to find out ways where they can coordinate better, cooperate better, share sovereignty when it makes sense to do so. So I think you are going to see moves at further integration. It will likely be slow, but there's other areas where there's a lot of pressure to coordinate more. And one of those areas is on the environment and climate change. And one of the major priorities of the incoming commission is to have this sort of Green New Deal where they're going to they've made these big commitments to climate change to reduce carbon emissions and to invest lots of money in R&D on building new technologies, new green technologies. And in order to do that, it's going to cost a fair amount of money. They're going to need to spend a lot of money at universities and at companies trying to build clean energy, trying to build, electric vehicles and all kinds of things that we can't even imagine right now. And in order to do that, you might see another push towards further integration and for cooperating a little bit more and maybe even changing some of the fiscal rules in the Stability and Growth Pact. So it sort of depends on the politics, but there are opportunities, and I think that you're going to see some action at least when the new commission takes office.
That's great. There's a question here. It relates to the euro, and I'll paraphrase. Do you get a sense that there are countries that are gearing up to go on the euro?
I would say in the short term, probably not. But you've just come out of maybe not just come out of Europe. Europe had two dips in this financial crisis. The first one was in 2008, and that was largely shared with the United States. But then in 2012, you had the second crisis in Europe that had to do with problems related to sovereign debt markets, and that shook some of the confidence in the euro a little bit. And there was even worries that countries like Greece, for example, might be forced to leave the single currency. But in the end, that didn't happen, and Greece and several other countries entered these programs where they got help and they got emergency loans and other forms of aid from their partners in Europe. And after a couple of years of pretty severe recessions, they started growing again. And so the one thing that could provide an impetus for other countries to join would be if there's a fair amount of progress on banking union, because as financial markets, capital markets get more integrated, it may make sense for some of the countries that have big banking sectors. So I'm thinking, for example, of like Sweden, they might want to join eventually. But we'll have to see what happens, and we'll also have to see what happens with Brexit, because Brexit has been this ongoing thing that's been, a source of a lot of uncertainty and has been dominating a lot of attention in Europe, and it's been harder for them to work on further integration and further deepening or further expansion, so long as this key issue remains unresolved.
Got it. Thank you. And if I may, I'd like to ask one other question myself. You mentioned early on in the presentation that there is the prospect of further enlargement to the Balkans and places like that. Is that something that there's a sense that might be on the near-term horizon, or is that a longer-term prospect?
Well, I think that for the ex-Yugoslav countries, I think there is the prospect of that happening in the medium term. There is the convergence criteria that these countries are going to have to meet, and these have to do not just with economic criteria like running balanced budgets and making sure that you're not running very high inflation rates and things like that, but also have to do with the rule of law and making sure that you have an independent judiciary and making sure that your domestic rules and regulations are at least aligned with European rules and regulations. And people who live in Serbia, for example, they feel like they're European and they want to be a part of Europe, I think. And once they have, gotten their domestic house in order, and Europe has agreed that they've gotten their house in order, I think that you could see things like that happening. I also mentioned that I think that Turkey, which has been in talks about joining the EU for a long time, I think that's looking much less likely, given what's going on domestically in Turkey these days. There's been a lot of erosion of democratic rights and institutions in Turkey. They've taken a very worrying turn towards authoritarianism, and they also have significant economic problems. So I don't think that you're likely to see it there. But in terms of the ex-Yugoslavia and Albania, I think that could happen in the medium term.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, we're almost at the hour, and no more questions. So it just leaves it for me to thank you very much for a really enlightening presentation. To trace the history of this fascinating part of the world and such an important part of the world, with or without the Euro challenges, is really very, very interesting. And so hats off to you, Ben, for a really terrific presentation. And everyone, I hope that it was as interesting to you as it was for us. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, David. It was my pleasure, and I just want to wish everybody good luck. I hope you found this useful, and I hope that you are getting fired up to compete in the Euro Challenge. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us or our partners at WISE, and we will try to help you in any way we can in terms of the research you're doing, questions you may have. So with that, goodbye and good luck.